When we talk about the hell of American soldiers in the Second World War, you'd most likely think of the Normandy landings, the Battle of the Bulge, or Berlin's Last Stand. You probably wouldn't think about the thousands of 19-year-old Marines dying on some small Pacific islands nobody's ever heard of. Which is strange, because what the US Marines went through was, by most measures, worse than anything that happened in Europe. So today we're going to correct that. We're going to tell you the entire warpath of the American Marine Corps in World War II, and paint you a picture of the hell they were living, fighting, and dying in. The turbulent journey for Marines began way back in the 18th century, when the American colonies were going to war with Britain. And if you know anything about Britain, you know that they were the world's greatest naval power. So Americans needed a way to fight against their ships. Ship-to-ship fighting would start with cannon fire, and then they'd eventually pull side by side, and men would board the enemy ship and fight on the deck. So you need soldiers on the ship to lead boarding parties and to protect your ship from the enemy doing the exact same thing, but also to go ashore when needed in small landing parties to raid coastal targets or seize supplies. These guys were called the Marines. I'm talking about the late 1700s, but does this land storming sound familiar to you? Anyway, the first recruiting drive was at Tun Tavern in Philadelphia on November 10th, 1775, which is why the Marines celebrate that date as their birthday. But before they'd earn all the glory in the Second World War, there'd be years with few exciting actions, and then a period of the American military not knowing what to do with them. That's because new ships came with steel hulls and gun turrets, where shipboard musket infantry didn't really have a place, and the naval combat shifted to long-range gunnery duels instead of soldiers boarding to fight with swords. Marines were used in a few small foreign interventions for quick landings, but they simply didn't have a clear service-defining mission anymore. So there were at least 9 documented attempts to merge the Marines with the Army. However, then came the Spanish-American War, when Marines showed how effective a quick-response naval landing force could be. And through some ups and downs, the American Marines slowly got their schools and testing grounds for amphibious doctrine, but then they got sent to France as part of the American Expeditionary Force when World War I broke out, where they fought in trenches as regular infantry. They got the nickname Devil Dogs from the Germans, and you can only guess why. When the war ended, Americans were once again in a crisis over what to do with them through the 1920s. That was until a man named Earl Hancock Ellis came along. He was a Marine himself for over 2 decades, and he was quite a military planner. And while tensions with Japan escalated in the years leading to the Second World War, this guy predicted how the next war would be fought in the Pacific. Ellis wrote a 30,000-word document in which he disturbingly nailed precisely how everything was going to happen there. He predicted how they were going to seize Japanese fortified islands with direct amphibious assaults. And he was so determined to find out what the Japanese were doing that he personally went on a reconnaissance mission under the cover of a commercial agent. He traveled to Japan and then through the Mandate Islands, where he took notes of everything he saw. But the Japanese pretty quickly became suspicious of him, and, well, his life ended in quite the mysterious way. There are stories ranging from him being an alcoholic and dying because of that, to the Japanese outright killing him. When another agent was sent to try to find out what happened to him, he came back delirious and barely conscious, with clear symptoms of poisoning. He was in hospital when a powerful earthquake destroyed it and killed him. So whatever he found out was buried with him right there. And by then, the war was looking more and more likely. Now, in the early 1930s, the Marines began to be the Marines as we know them from World War II. However, before we get to combat, you just have to see the tactics and equipment they'd be preparing. You see, the first major problem was how to bring men from ships to beaches, which is where a guy called Higgins comes into the story. Because standard V-shaped hull boats could get stuck in the shallow water. He came up with the Eureka boat, with a flat bottom and protected propellers, which could operate in just 18 inches of water and bring the Marines directly onto the beach without getting stuck. The bow ramp came next, the design of which was actually taken from Japanese craft, so the troops could disembark quickly from the front, immediately running onto the beach instead of climbing over the sides of the boat. And the ramp was made from steel, so it protected them from fire coming from the shore, although the sides were just plywood and the top was open, so the boats were quite vulnerable, which you're also going to hear about in a bit. This turned into the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, or better known as the Higgins Boat. It was 36 feet long, 11 feet wide, and could go some 12 knots, carrying 36 fully equipped Marines. or a jeep with 12 men, with up to 8,000 pounds of cargo. These were about to land every Marine on every Pacific beach and every Allied soldier on every European beach. Now, the second revolutionary part of the equipment was the LVT, or Landing Vehicle Tract. This thing was a vehicle with paddle cleats on its tracks that also propelled it through water, which would be incredibly important for the Pacific atolls surrounded by coral reefs, where Higgins boats would get stuck, which you're also going to hear about, unfortunately. Then you had the LCM, the Landing Craft Mechanized, that could carry one tank or a heavy vehicle, and the LCT, the Landing Craft Tank, which was a British-designed vessel that Americans adopted, about 100 to 120 feet long, that could carry 3 to 5 Sherman tanks. It could also cross the ocean, not just go ship to shore, and these were used in Europe, in Normandy, to bring tanks to the beaches. And on top of all of that, there were the LSTs, landing ship tanks, the big ones that could carry around 20 tanks and several hundred men and could beach themselves directly on the shore, open their bow doors, and unload everything quickly straight on the sand. The LCI, the Landing Craft Infantry, did the same just for the infantry. You could carry some 200 infantrymen and drop them on a beach. However, when you're going to assault a heavily defended beach, those guys in landing craft, moving slowly across open water, were just sitting ducks for the enemy dug in on shore with heavy weapons. Marines couldn't really shoot back from their boats, so they had to be protected by heavy naval gunfire, meaning big guns on battleships would be hammering positions on the beach. And there was also air support, with fighters dropping bombs or strafing enemy positions on the beach in coordination with the landing troops. These two were the Marines' fire support, and without them they wouldn't even live long enough to get to the beach. But making the system work flawlessly together was another thing. Firing accurately from a moving ship miles away from the target wasn't the easiest thing in the world, shall we say, so there had to be shore fire control parties that went with the assault waves, with radios to direct naval artillery fire and make sure they didn't kill their own guys. Same goes for close air support. The operation would begin with the pre-landing bombardment days earlier, with the goal to destroy as many enemy positions as possible before the Marines stormed the beaches. On the day of the assault, the troop ships anchor offshore beyond the range of enemy guns, and the Marines climb down cargo nets into landing craft that have been lowered into the water from big ships. They all wait for the first wave to get assembled, and then, on H hour, they go towards beaches and waves at set intervals. Each successive wave would carry more troops and heavier weapons, then tanks and supporting vehicles. They wanted the first wave to hit the beach in a long line and hit the sand at roughly the same moment. As they approach the beaches, the naval gunfire shifts inland to keep defenders suppressed. When the boats hit the beach, the ramps drop and Marines storm out, spread out and start moving inland, while behind them, the next wave arrives. That was the theory, at least. They were training and rehearsing, but the actual battle was a whole other story. And this concept hadn't actually been tested yet. I mean, the British tried this amphibious landing thing at Gallipoli, where they wanted to outflank the Ottomans, and then got obliterated when almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Naval bombardment pretty much completely missed fortified positions. Landing craft were just rowboats, and there was no actual plan for the troops once they got ashore. They couldn't even communicate with their ships. There was a supply catastrophe, and the whole thing caused 250,000 Allied casualties without achieving anything. So while all the other countries saw this and concluded that amphibious operations were impossible, Marines were studying them meticulously and trying to correct every mistake and work it out. But still, the lessons had to be paid in blood to be learned. So by early 1941, the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions had been activated and were ready for war. On paper, at least. While they had spent 20 years inventing the future of amphibious warfare, they had for some reason kept the M1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle that their granddads carried in World War I, even though the army had already adopted the new semi-automatic M1 Garand back in 1936. That was because the Marines had tested the early Garands and found them riddled with problems like gas system flaws, a tendency to jam on the 7th round, and so on. And they didn't want any of that in tropical sand and saltwater conditions. So when they finally adopted the Garand, they kept it in rear area units until the flaws got ironed out, which meant that the frontline divisions would fight with the good old Springfield bolt action for some time. The Marines were even still wearing World War I pattern helmets and still fielding M1917 Browning water-cooled machine guns. That was because Germany and Europe would be deemed the primary theatre, so the Marines in the Pacific would fight the whole war with second priority on everything. Then on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor. The next day, America declared war on Japan, and 3 days later on Germany. And what followed was the worst stretch of the war for the United States. Japan simply rolled across the Pacific and overran the American bases where Marines were stationed. They were fighting for their lives against the sudden Japanese amphibious landings that just overwhelmed them. The Marine garrison on Wake Island held out for 2 weeks before being overrun, and the survivors were taken prisoner. What they then went through in Japanese captivity was just hell on earth. Things that happened there were so bad that mentioning them on YouTube would get the video taken down. The Philippines fell, and the 4th Marine Regiment was forced to surrender in May 1942, which was the largest mass surrender in Marine Corps history. Meanwhile, the Marine Corps was scrambling to expand from a pre-war strength of about 65,000 men to the 500,000 it would eventually reach. The tide finally started to turn in the summer of 1942, after the Battle of the Coral Sea stopped Japan's southward push towards Australia. In June, the Battle of Midway destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in 3 days and broke Japan's offensive momentum. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States was in a position to think about going on the offensive. And so, on August 7th, 1942, 8 months after Pearl Harbor, the 1st Marine Division landed in Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, which would be the first American ground offensive of the war, where the whole amphibious concept would finally be tested. The Allies had to go on the offensive. They realized that the Japanese were building an airfield on an island called Guadalcanal that could endanger Allied supply lines now that the enemy was on the doorstep of Australia. So it had to be taken out before it got finished, and the task went to the 1st Marine Division. The plan was called Operation Watchtower, although men ashore renamed it Operation Shoestring because of how few resources they had. But anyway, on the morning of August 7th, 1942, about 11,000 Marines landed on the north coast of Guadalcanal and 3,000 more on smaller islands around it. The Japanese garrison was mostly construction troops and Korean laborers. They panicked under the naval bombardment and ran into the jungle, and by the afternoon of the next day, the Marines had walked into the unfinished airfield, everything going nice and easy. That was just for 36 hours. On the night of August 8th into the 9th, 7 Japanese cruisers and a destroyer ambushed the Allied screening force in pitch dark and sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers, killing over 1,000 sailors. The surviving carriers and ships then retreated in fear of getting destroyed as well, and Marines were left ashore, without naval gunfire support, without air cover, and with only whatever supplies they had on them. They were left on their own in the jungle. I mean, not really on their own, technically. There were mosquitoes, malaria, heat, and hunger, and of course the Japanese to keep them company. 2/3 of Marines got malaria, on top of having to eat anything they could find to survive. They had rice that the enemy had left, although it was full of ants and worms, so they ate coconut and lizards and whatever else they could find. Hunger soon became an even bigger problem than the enemy. However, those Japanese that ran away into the jungle on the other side of the island when Marines appeared were now about to come back. They sent about 900 elite Japanese soldiers to retake the airfield the Marines had so easily captured. They had previously fought a poorly equipped Chinese army that virtually had no machine guns and was armed with old bolt-action rifles, so aggressive infantry charges were working really well in obliterating the Chinese army, and they now tried the same thing with the American Marines. Sergeant Jacob Vouza was a scout behind Japanese lines, and he actually ran into the advancing enemy, and they caught him. He was tied to a tree, interrogated, then bayoneted, and left for dead. But he wasn't ready to die. Once the Japanese left, he somehow freed himself, and then crawled for hours through the jungle until he reached Marine lines. Before he even received any treatment, he warned them about the upcoming attack, and the guy actually survived it all, and lived to be 90 years old, by the way. Marines now positioned their machine guns and 2 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister shot, and waited. Just after midnight, the first wave screamed banzai and charged across the sandbar in the open. And well, the same tactic that worked against the Chinese forces turned out to be a bit less effective against machine guns and canister shot. They were chopped to pieces. Then the Marines counterattacked and surrounded the survivors and wiped them out. About 800 out of those 900 Japanese soldiers were killed, and only 15 wounded prisoners were taken. It was the first time American Marines saw their enemy up close, and what happened in that initial meeting would define the rest of the war from there. And let me tell you, the war in the Pacific was not like the war in Europe. The main reason was the Japanese soldier, and the hate between them and the Marines that spiraled simply out of control. You see, the German soldier would usually surrender if his position was lost, and he'd most often be treated under the Geneva Conventions, similarly to Allied soldiers back in Europe. There were atrocities and all that, of course, but in isolated cases. But in the Pacific, there was no such luxury. There were no rules, and you really wouldn't want to get captured alive by either side. Japanese soldiers were heavily indoctrinated by old Bushido code and brainwashed by their godlike leaders from birth. They were above other nations, and there was nothing worse than to surrender alive to the enemy. This was the deepest possible disgrace a soldier could bring on himself, much worse than death, and he'd even bring strain and shame on his family forever. So, with this thinking, you got the banzai charges, soldiers fighting no matter how desperate the situation was, and trying to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible before dying in some disturbingly creative ways. For example, they'd prepare grenades with safety pins taken out, and the spoon held with a rubber band soaked in gasoline. As long as the spoon was held by the rubber band, the grenade wouldn't go off, but the gasoline would, in time, disintegrate the rubber and release the spoon. So they would put grenades in the setup in their pockets, and once they were killed and lying somewhere in the field, if a curious Allied soldier came to investigate, for example, the grenade would go off, possibly killing him. They would fake surrender only to get close enough to activate grenades. Wounded Japanese soldiers tried to kill American medics who were helping them. And there was even a case when one grabbed the scalpel from a medic's hand and stabbed him with it. Besides booby-trapping their bodies, they also shouted medic or corpsman in English to try to fool the medic into thinking there was a wounded American so they could shoot him. Not to mention many, many other methods. And the creativity doesn't stop there. What they did to capture Allied soldiers was no less disturbing. Those who survived the initial quote-unquote treatment would be taken into prisoner camps where chances of living to the end of the war and being released were not the best in the world. Pretty soon, torture, mutilation, and other indescribable things were happening on both sides because of this. Prisoners were rarely taken, and if they were, I already told you what would happen, so no one was really surrendering anyway, but actually just trying to take as many enemies with them as they could before dying. Something like this was rarely seen in Europe, but it was very, very common in the Pacific. And the US Marines learned all of this pretty much in the first week on Guadalcanal. So they didn't really look at the enemy as humans anymore. Units bragged about not taking prisoners, and quote-unquote souvenir-taking from the enemy got to the point that a direct order had to be issued that no part of the enemy's body may be used as a souvenir. I don't think I need to go beyond that. The loop was pretty soon closed, and you'd simply rather die than be taken alive, no matter which side you were on. However, believe it or not, the real hell for the American Marines was only about to begin, with a few upcoming battles, each of them being horrific in its own unique way. And we'll cover them all in part 2, which you can watch right here, right now.